Hi. I find it interesting how an innocuous post about a conversation I had with a parent about pronouns has actually sparked a lot of interest, and I've had a lot of questions. And just in speaking about pronouns in the last video and blog that I did, it was just one of myriad predictors of reading difficulty that I was speaking to with that example. But then, interestingly enough, I've tripped into several conversations about pronouns since then. And it actually links into my most recent blog post, which has gone up, which is talking about looking at the source whenever there's a performance breakdown or some difficulty that you want to go to the source. And so in keeping with that theme and looking specifically at pronouns, I mean, it's really interesting. So, for example, in something like ADHD or maybe fetal alcohol syndrome, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, when we're looking at executive functioning deficits, one of the hallmarks and things that we show up is that there's often an impairment to the working memory. And what we know from grammar acquisition is that one of the reasons that children are late in acquiring grammar, it's actually pointing to some difficulty in verbal working memory. And so, for example, there's a lot of information available in how grammar forms pattern, but when children aren't really attending to those grammar forms, they tend not to pick them up. And then when we look at things like exceptions to the rules, so things like irregular past tense like blow and blew, or irregular plurals like goose and geese, children tend not to memorize those exceptions to the rule when they have poor verbal working memory. So in the case of something like ADHD, we can see pronoun errors show up, and we see that there is a performance or an impact to the language profile, and yet it doesn't necessarily indicate a true language-based disorder. So there's an underlying difficulty there within the ADHD that points to the attention and the verbal working memory difficulty that then impacts language performance and pronouns. Now, when we look at something like autism, one of the core deficits by the nature of the disorder is that there is an inattention to social information, or sometimes just a disinterest in social information. So in looking at how pronouns are used, whether somebody is the subject or the object is going to dictate whether it's she or whether it's her. As well, gender is a social construct, and a lot of children with autism just are not paying attention to a social construct. So whether it's a boy or it's a girl is going to dictate whether it's she or whether it's he, and a lot of children with autism are just not attending to that information. And as such, they have difficulty acquiring pronoun forms because there is a lot of social information embedded in something like pronoun use. So it's really quite interesting, again, to go and look at the source of the performance deficit, that children with autism often do have a language-based difficulty. But again, it's not that they're incapable of acquiring grammar, it's just that the social information that's dictating pronoun use is elusive to them. So some explicit teaching around those social constructs that are dictating the pronouns is a way to get access to some of the grammar forms there. So it's really interesting, in looking at something like pronouns. And we have a lot of children that show up in our work, difficulty with literacy that's coming from difficulty in the sound processing system. And what we know about difficulties in the sound processing system is then it often impacts grammar acquisition. And when you think about something like she versus he, the real difference there is a difference between sh and h. So children that are not perceiving the difference between sounds readily are missing a lot of information about how those two words are separate. And then because they're not attending to the difference between those two words as discrete words, they're not necessarily attending to the patterns or the linguistic constraints about how those separate words are then patterning and being used in language. So the sound processing deficit then leads to some difficulty in the expressive grammar use. And again, looking at sound processing, it is a fundamental level or unit of language. So the sound processing difficulty is a language-based disorder. The impact to the expressive language is actually secondary. And I know there's a lot of people that have been interested in my posting on Ain't That Puff Enough, where we talk about sound processing and the impacts that it has on language and later on literacy. So again, it's all really fascinating in that, you can walk around a preschool or a kindergarten room and you can really start to pick out a lot of pronoun errors. And it's worth attending to and seeing what is going on with those kids, because it can be a predictor of an underlying deficit in autism or in ADHD or in fetal alcohol spectrum disorder or in sound processing, or it could be a specific language impairment. It could be a true language-based disorder. And it's interesting to look at that all of those things manifest in the same way, and yet there are different sources and different parts of the brain and different culprits, different levels of processing that are contributing to the error. So again, I'm interested to see how this concept or this topic of pronouns has really piqued a lot of interest, and a lot of the conversations that I'm ending up in about so many different types of kids that have maybe that in common, pronoun difficulties, and yet underneath or underlying is a very specific deficit or disorder that is individual to the child. So it just goes to show you that there is a lot of value in starting to dig around in what is a child's individual learning profile, and then how does that manifest in their performance across a lot of different language-based tasks. Peer interaction, expressive language, grammar use, reading, writing, and spelling acquisition, vocabulary, concept knowledge, all of that stuff. So anyway, that's what's on my mind today. Hope you're having a good one. We'll talk soon.